we were lucky enough to visit Aerospace Bristol and step inside one of the most iconic aircraft ever built, the Concorde. In this tour we'll take a closer look at what made her so special, from the passenger cabin through to the heart of the aircraft. So, let's get started in the cockpit.
Welcome on board the flight deck of the last Concorde. So this is Concorde number 216, GBOAF, Golf Bravo Oscar Alpha Foxtrot, or as I love to call her, Foxy. So this was the last complete aircraft ever built here at Filton, and also for the purpose of your video today, the last Concorde ever built, but more importantly, the last Concorde to ever fly, when she arrived here way back on the 26th of November 2003, carrying British Airways staff on the final ever Concorde flight. Years of life left in her upon retirement. This particular Concorde has only done around 18,250 flying hours, so that's about roughly the same as a 3 to 4 year old Boeing. So from technical standpoint, back in 2003, years of life left in her, but obviously due to situations and politics, she's now a museum piece. So here we are on the flight deck of this magnificent machine. Most people, when they come in here, are a little bit agog at the sheer volume of the number of switches and gauges on here, but Concorde is actually a complete fly-by-wire aircraft. So fly-by-wire years before Airbus ever came up with the concept. There is obviously an electrical mechanical backup, but majority is all electronic and fly-by-wire. So what we're going to do, I'm going to break this down into sections for you. We're going to start here with the forward console and go through this section first. So Concorde has what's called an inertial navigation system on here. There's 3 systems on the aircraft, one here which the flight engineer would monitor, captain and co-pilot. Now when Concorde was parked at the gate, they would start plotting the route for that day, whether it was a scheduled flight to New York or Barbados, or maybe a special charter flight to anywhere around the world. They would all put in the coordinates and the references for the flight. The system would then pull up from memory the actual waypoints and pre-fill the data for the flight. And then what the 3 crew members would do is they would cross-reference each system to make sure that it corresponded and was accurate. But here it's just standard radio selectors here for the aircraft. Coming up to here, we've got the main throttles. Now Concorde's got 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus 593 engines, or Bristol Siddeley engines actually, before Rolls-Royce took over. And these engines are very, very special because they're the only commercial pure turbojet engines that had reheat or afterburner. Now the reheats were selected by utilizing these 4 piano keys here, and they would be put on all together for takeoff. And when Concorde was at full takeoff weight of around 182 tons, the engines with the reheats applied would accelerate the aircraft to 250 miles an hour from a standing start in around about 40 seconds. Or when it was on a special charter flight around the Bay of Biscay, the acceleration was faster than a Formula 1 racing car. Reheats were then turned off after the initial climb out of Heathrow after roughly around 90 seconds, and then they were kept off until around about 25 miles off the coast of Swansea, and then they would be deployed back in pairs to accelerate the aircraft through the sound barrier. They would be left on until about Mach 1.7 and then turned off, and then Concorde could do what no other aircraft could do, continue to climb, continue to accelerate all the way up to twice the speed of sound without the use of reheats or afterburners. So the throttles, obviously you've got a reverse thrust selector as well when Concorde comes into land. Concorde doesn't have any flaps or slats to slow it down on landing, so the reverse thrust coupled with the carbon fibre brakes were used. Moving on, you've obviously got the trim selector here. This here actually has got a very a comical French bell sound to it. So when the aircraft is actually being pitched, it sounds like a French bicycle, maybe something the French put in. Moving to the centre part of the flight deck here, these are all for the 4 engines. So they illustrate things like the oil pressure, the amount of fuel, the power, etc. Upon takeoff, if you've got 4 greens there, you know you're good to go. If one of those flashes amber, well, you know you've got to slow down and have a look, see what's going on. Just above here, you've got the brake temperature on the aircraft, and if there is any problem with the brakes, this will flash red to say the brakes have failed. And then just coming to the right, you've got the landing gear selector. Now we need to illustrate at this point one of the most famous instruments on the aircraft. This looks like a little automatic gearbox setup, but that actually controls the nose and visor on the aircraft. So the first selection is to have the visor come down into the nose structure. The second then is to lower the nose to 5 degrees, which is the position of the nose for takeoff and subsonic cruise. And then the final selection is all the way down to the bottom, which will lower the nose to 12.5 degrees. And that position is what's used for landing into any airfield. Moving up to the top is the flight director setup. So on either side you've got the radio settings and the navigation systems. The main section here is your autopilot and everything connected with that. And then you've got the auto throttles, which I mentioned to you are still dialed in from the last flight to the settings and the throttles. And then these little 3 buttons here are quite special to Concorde. You've got what's called Mach hold, which obviously is to complete bit like cruise control when it's traveling at twice the speed of sound. And you've got another system up here called max climb, max cruise. Once Concorde is basically burning fuel and has gone through the resistance of the sound barrier, as the aircraft becomes lighter, she continues to climb and accelerate. And they put that system on, and as I mentioned, it's a little like cruise control on your car. It keeps the aircraft continuously flying at twice the speed of sound. Moving over to this section here, the instruments are duplicated obviously for the co-pilot as well. You've got obviously your artificial horizon, airspeed, compass, and then this symbol here, this is the only electronic instrument on the flight deck. This is what's called TCAS, and this was fitted to all aircraft. It was a FAA regulation in America for all arriving traffic into the United States, and that was fitted to the aircraft in the mid-90s. On the side stick here, this controls the nose wheel for steering. You've got a weather radar. Obviously the yoke is what's called a ram horn yoke, so completely different to lots of aircraft. You've got the buttons here to disengage the autopilot, so if you want to fly the aircraft manually. Coming up to the overhead panel, this here is the master warning system, so anything that needs attention will flash red. If they all flash red, you know you've got a major problem. And then just coming back, you've got the fire controls for each of the 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines. These are the selection switches for the hydraulics. And then just auxiliary switches here which control the navigation lights, the anti-collision light on the rear of the aircraft, cabin lights, etc, etc. But this one here is to lock the flight deck. After 9/11, all aircraft have to have a secure cockpit door. Concorde was no exception, and they actually test fitted the security door for the flight deck on a Concorde that used to be stored over on the airfield here, which is the same Concorde that's now on display in Brooklands. So that's the main part of the captain and the co-pilot section. So we're going to move now over to the flight engineers panel, which usually most people gasp at when they just see the sheer volume of switches here. It's actually broken down into sections. I'm not saying it's simple for one moment, but it is broken down. So the main part here controls the fuel on the aircraft. There's 13 fuel tanks on Concorde, but 2 of them are trim tanks located in the front and the rear of the aircraft. What the flight engineer would do, he would be presented with the load sheet, as would the captain, for that particular flight. They would put the information into the computer, and that would then generate what the center of gravity should be throughout the duration of the flight envelope, from taxiing to landing basically. Flight engineer would then pump fuel from one end of the aircraft to the other to make sure the centre of gravity was level for the duration of the flight. The tanks obviously in the wings as well are continuously pumped through as well. Hydraulics, 3 hydraulic systems on the aircraft. They're all contained in the top right hand corner, as are the batteries. You've also got the emergency generators as well, which are fed from the batteries down here. Coming over to here, this controls all the air conditioning on the system, and obviously for the cabin as well. One thing I should point out on the aircraft, the fuel is continuously pumped around the aircraft to keep the skin of the aircraft quite cool. So there's some dual uses on the fuel on the aircraft. Now this part here is very, very important. If there's one thing that made Concorde so successful, where the American and obviously the Russian versions weren't, it was this computer. Now this computer was designed by a British firm way back in the 60s, and it basically controls the intakes to the engines, which we'll talk about now when we go downstairs. At the front of our Rolls-Royce Olympus engines there's an 11-foot intake which has a series of ramps. Those ramps are computer controlled, and what they do is they slow the air down from 1,350 miles an hour down to around about 350-400 miles an hour in at 11 feet. And it enabled the aircraft to cruise supersonically for up to 3 hours at a time. We will go more into that at the time, but this computer was cutting edge, and it's still cutting edge in 2025. Okay, engine start down here, so you've got the bleed pumps and the start valves, etc. to start the engines. The brakes and obviously the temperature for the brakes are all controlled up here as well. And the flight engineer also has the switches here to apply the brake fans after takeoff and landing, and also the lighting as well. Okay, so this is the forward galley. So you've got the ovens here and the catering, crew seat, and also crew seat for here as well. Now these here are one of the things that used to break down on the aircraft more times than anything, the coffee makers, notorious for breaking down. Very restricted space, as you can see. There's a little sink here, and obviously hot water and cold water as well. There is a table that comes out here so the meals could be prepared during flight. So no, we can't do it now. And then obviously, as I mentioned to you, you've got the ovens here as well. Okay, as we move forward, when Concorde was in service, this area here always had a fresh floral arrangement, and there was also an LED or a backlight which would illuminate this area. These are just cupboards, you know, for various parts for the flight. Forward bathroom is in here. Coming in by here, just lockers for people who had overcoats or things of that nature that were brought onto the aircraft before they boarded, because obviously space was at a premium. As we come into the forward cabin, the first thing you're probably going to see are the cabin displays. So this was basically your entertainment aside from the fabulous catering on board the aircraft. So these would basically be illuminated from pushback, where it would say welcome to Concorde, etc. But everybody was waiting for the magic sign when it went through Mach 1 all the way up to Mach 2.02. And if you're on a typical New York crossing, you would get up to an altitude of between 56 to 58,000 feet. On a crossing to Barbados, because of the difference in the air temperature, you would have got up to 60,000 feet, which was Concorde's maximum ceiling, if you like, in commercial service. They did get a couple higher during the testing period. So row 1, everybody seems to think that this is Millionaire's Row, but that's not strictly true. Concorde is all one class, Concorde class, all the way through its 40 seats in the forward cabin to its 60 seats in the rear cabin, all with the same 38 inches of legroom. So that's the same dimensions of space, if you like, legroom wise, as a premium economy or World Traveller Plus for British Airways today. So mentioned to you a little earlier, these beautiful seats, these were fitted to the British Airways fleet, or 5 of the 7 British Airways fleet I should say, in 2001 for the relaunch, with our aircraft being the very first. They were designed by a design company in London called Factory Design Limited, and they cost £14,000 a pair way back in 2001. The structure is all carbon fibre, and because they were around about 20% lighter than the seats they replaced, it offset the safety modifications from the Paris crash which had to be fitted. As a result of this interior, it saved British Airways around about £1 million a year in fuel costs, which would have paid for the upgrade. The seats are actually very, very beautiful. They're all trimmed in this blue Connolly leather, so the same as you'd have in a Rolls-Royce, and they are all one structure. The armrest is particularly impressive because this is something the designers were very, very proud of. The armrest sits obviously nice and neat when it's not required, but when it comes down in flight, if you look, it's got a lovely twist in motion. So it comes out, and as it goes up, you'll see it twist in before it goes back into the armrest. So on a typical flight, you had the best of the best that was available at the time. Menus which were designed by chefs such as Michel Roux Jr., Anton Mosman, etc. Concorde had its own wine cellar at London Heathrow, where you would have wines which you could not get anywhere else in the world because it was such an exclusive club membership, if you like. Lots of frequent flyers who used the aircraft. Some of the very famous ones who flew it very regular were David Frost, the journalist, of course, celebrities, sports personalities, politicians. You know, it was used primarily as a business tool, but it was also used to carry lots of medical supplies back and forth to New York as well because of the very quick time. So it's something that, of course, back in 2003, if you wished, you could cross the Atlantic in 3 hours 20 minutes, do a day trip to New York and come back on the evening Concorde and be back in Heathrow at 10:30 at night. Obviously now, 22 years later, that's no longer possible. So as I mentioned, the cabin is all one class. As we go through, you'll notice the windows on Concorde are very, very small. There's a good reason for that. It was obviously for the structural integrity of the airframe should a window crack at 60,000 feet, and it would give the crew enough time to descend the aircraft to a safe altitude before full cabin depressurization would take place.
We will reach an altitude of approximately 58,000 feet. Display screens giving flight information.
One thing I should point out as well, on the armrest here, which we have covered, but I'll take one off to show you, you'll see the British Airways Speedbird motif. And that was from the guys in factory design. One of the directors of factory design, Adam White, he had a friend who done molds for Formula One race cars, and after a visit to BA's headquarters he noticed the Speedbird logo and he said, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could fit that to the armrest? And it's three-dimensional cast aluminium design built into the armrest of the British Airways logo, and every seat has got it.
While passengers browsed the duty-free magazine. While the final cuts were cleared, passengers were given a complimentary gift to remind them of their flight. This could be Concorde stationery, luggage tags, or
Branding, of course, is very subtle on the aircraft. If you look on the seat belts, you'll see again the British Airways logo, and it's also etched into the headrest as well. The briefing from British Airways was, when factory design were given the contract to redesign the interior, they wanted everyone to know this was a British Airways Concorde without it saying British Airways everywhere. So you had very subtle designs built into the various areas of the cabin to basically let people know what you were flying. So as I said, it's only the seats and the carpet that were fitted because of the premature retirement. So the second part would have seen brand new blue leather bulkheads and new cabin displays fitted to the aircraft, along with new bathrooms and also brand new galleys as well, which would have been glass, uplit and stainless steel. The bathrooms themselves were actually quite a thing of beauty considering the space restraints. They were all uplit with subtle lighting and again lots of glass and nice aqua colours to give that illusion that you were in a 5-star hotel bathroom within a very confined space. The tap, for example, that was used for the sink, it cost over £1,000. And again, you're going back now to the early 2000s. So we'll go and have a little look now at one of the bathrooms on the aircraft, which originates from the early 90s when British Airways did its previous refit. So as you can see, space is quite constrained in there. The bathrooms would have been stocked with toiletries from either Kiehl's or Molten Brown. I think towards the end of service it was Kiehl's exclusively that supplied Concorde. But the new bathrooms were, although they were the same size, they looked bigger, if that makes sense, because of the design. And I'll try and get a photo to show you so you can see the difference. Obviously in flight there were doors on here. So we're coming now into the rear cabin, another crew area by here. So I'll leave you turn around at this point because the aircraft is set up as it would have been in service. So as I mentioned to you, the interior wasn't designed by Sir Terence Conran, but the dinner services and the cushions and blankets were all Conran design. The rest of the interior was designed by Factory Design Limited. So you've got some more wardrobes in here, and right at the back of the aircraft, of course, you've got the rear galley. Okay, so we're in our exhibition room here at Aerospace Bristol, Filton, and we're going to start with some of the actual wind tunnel models which we use to define and perfect the beautiful shape of Concorde. Concorde wasn't designed to look pretty. It's just the perfect design that came out of hundreds of hours of testing in wind tunnels with different wing shapes and designs and models. And these are actually the models that were used in the wind tunnel in the final stages of the wind tunnel testing to perfect that beautiful shape. Coming over to be here, while we were on board the aircraft, I mentioned about how Factory Design were basically given the brief, if you like, from British Airways to redesign the interior of their 7-strong Concorde fleets. Sir Terence Conran and partners were responsible for the dinner services and the cushions, and then Factory Design were responsible for everything else. So we've seen the beautiful seats and the carpets. The second part of the upgrade, had the aircraft stayed in service, would have seen brand new cabin displays fitted. And one of the things that they were quite keen on incorporating into the cabin displays, you still had the traditional, Mach 2 sign and the height, etc. But they wanted to replicate the flight deck by having a moving dial through the flight. So you had like a bit like an airspeed indicator from the flight deck, and also for the outside air temperature, and that would move like dials during the flight. This is a model of the twisting armrest that was put into the seats, along with one of the molds for the British Airways Speedbird motif. These are other sections from the fatigue rig that was held at Farnborough, with the main section being the flight deck roof and forward windscreen section from that test rig, which was used to basically simulate thousands of supersonic cycles to determine the amount of fatigue and cycles that the airframe could withstand. This rubber section here is actually a piece of Kevlar. Now, this is what was fitted to all of the British Airways and Air France fleet for the return to service in 2001. So these were fitted to actually only 5 of the 7 British Airways Concordes. The last 2 were never modified, and also 4 of the 5 remaining Air France Concordes. One Air France Concorde was going through what was called a D check at the time of retirement, and never received these upgrades and never flew again. But these were placed into the wings of the aircraft, and along with the new tyres designed by Michelin and the armour plated around the wiring in the undercarriage, these would have eliminated that catastrophic accident that happened out in Gunness in July 2000. As we come here, I'm actually really keen on these. These are from the classroom that would all the flight engineers and also Rolls-Royce would have used during the training phase, if you like, to be converted onto Concorde. So you've got a mock-up of the centre of gravity, and also you've got a mock-up of the air intake system that we looked at briefly on the flight deck. The intakes are an incredible thing on the aircraft, and they're one of the three key things that made the aircraft perform as it did and operate for up to 3 hours at a time at supersonic speeds. It's got a lovely little illustration here of the ramps, of the intake ramps. I prefer this to the actual visuals they've got in the aircraft, because when this is working you can actually see the ramps moving, which is again a wonderful thing. So the flight deck here, the mock-up, it's actually a good picture of the prototype which differs to Alpha Foxtrot's flight deck. But this is a Rolls-Royce simulator, a training simulator, which was used primarily for the engineers and the flight engineers on the aircraft. So the volunteers here have done a fantastic job in lighting it up so it now works as a simulator, but the design of it arcs back to the prototype variants of the aircraft rather than the production variants of the aircraft. This glass case here are belongings to the late Brian Trubshaw, who was the chief test pilot and the first British person to fly Concorde, of course. They were donated to Filton by Brian's widow, Yvonne. She was adamant that she wanted everything kept at Filton. So this is his flying suit from the testing days, obviously along with his cases and other items as well. As we come to this section here, we've got a selection of seats from British Airways through the years and how they differ. So you've got the original 1970s seats, and then you've got these seats by here, which were fitted to the British Airways fleet in the late 80s to the early 90s. And then the second set of grey seats, which were donated by factory design again for us. These were fitted to the British Airways fleet from 1992 up until the relaunch in 2001, and when they were obviously then replaced by the blue Connolly leather ones. Okay, so this case here, this is a little bit bittersweet for me. So this is the flight engineer's cap from the final flight into Filton. This was placed in the flight engineer's panel because on every supersonic flight, Concorde grew between 6 to 10 inches in length. On the final flight into Filton, the flight engineer and the crew all signed the inside of the hat, and a gap appeared on the flight engineer's panel of about 4 to 5 inches. They placed the hat in there, and when the aircraft decelerated to subsonic speed and the gap retracted, that hat was then stuck in there permanently. Unfortunately, when the aircraft was moved over here, that hat mysteriously was pulled out. So these items here are what you would have received on board the aircraft during the British Airways penultimate years. These are the seat safety cards from the relaunch for the new factory design seats, your flight packs, etc. British Airways crew uniforms, with this being the last issued one. And then we've also got the Conran dinner services, which were fitted to the aircraft for the relaunch. Now, unfortunately, because of 9/11, the aircraft never flew with the actual knives and forks, which were beautiful stainless steel design. All aircraft had to fly with plastic cutlery after 9/11. So although they were all designed, the cutlery never flew. And then over here, we've just got some items of memorabilia through the years. Now this here is particularly nice. This is an Olympus 593 turbine blade, but it's actually mounted on Bristol blue glass, which I'm particularly keen on that. And then as we move down here, these are gifts which were designed by factory design for Concorde's retirement. Now this ruler is the exact same length that the aircraft expanded in supersonic flight, and it's manufactured along with the keyring from the aluminium alloy that Concorde was manufactured out of, a very special alloy called hiduminium, and they are very, very sought after. And then you've just got some first aid covers and just memorabilia through the years. And there's one of your model kits. Okay, so really good view here of the complete aircraft. So contrary to what people say, Concorde isn't really a small aircraft in lengthwise. She's 204 feet long from the tip of the nose to the rear fuselage. So only about 15-20 feet shorter than a 747, but obviously very streamlined. The wingspan from tip to tip is actually only around 84 feet. So we're going to go around the aircraft just pointing out some of the unique features that made Concorde so special, but also so successful from a technical standpoint as well. So we've got this beautiful nose structure at the front of the aircraft, and if you notice, the structure of the nose hinges here. So basically just above the flight deck. But where's the forward landing gear? Well, the landing gear on Concorde is some 32 feet behind from where the crew sit in the flight deck, which gives a very unique perspective when you're taxiing the aircraft around the taxiways of airport, because you have to overshoot the taxiways from the flight deck because your nose wheel is some 30 feet plus behind you.
People sometimes complain that they would be standing in their greenhouse.
So this is the forward undercarriage bay.
Crack pane of glass in their greenhouse.
Concorde's undercarriage, forward undercarriage, again is very unique because it retracts in a forward motion up into these main doors. On the side here, you've got the power steering jacks to the aircraft. And then coming around the side, the ground crew, if they needed to speak to anyone up on the flight deck for the engine startup or any instructions, they would have a headset on, which would be plugged in here into the intercom system on the aircraft, and the flight crew would then be able to communicate with whoever was on the ground. So again, forward undercarriage structure, you notice the wiring going up, of course, and then that retracts forward into the main undercarriage forward doors there. So this is the main cargo hold on the aircraft. This shark fin is just one of the VHF antennas, and then you'll notice we've got these amber, used to be amber panels on the underside of the aircraft. They are the radio altimeters. So they would pick things up as on an approach to an airfield, things, you know, when you're approaching on the glide slope, and you would hear things called out 500 feet, 400 feet, etc., all the way down to 15 feet. So the aircraft would then pick up the correct height from the runway. If you look on the outer section of the wing, you'll see all these black panels. They are de-icing mats, electric de-icing mats, which would stop the build-up of ice during cold weather temperatures, because obviously if you had ice going into the intakes of the engines, that would cause a major problem. Now the wing is one of the three key things on this aircraft which made it very, very special and successful from a technical standpoint. Everybody assumes that Concorde wing is just a straightforward delta wing as you'd find on a Vulcan or any other military jet, but it's actually two wings rolled into one, because Concorde, if you think about it, is two aircraft rolled into one. It's a supersonic aircraft, of course, but it's also a subsonic aircraft, a commercial subsonic aircraft, which has to behave exactly the same way as any other commercial aircraft. So the wing has got lots of twists and camber built into it. It's called a double Ogilvy design, and it provides a tremendous amount of lift at subsonic speed when the aircraft is pitched up. And you'll notice as we walk along the leading edge of the wing, how it starts off streamlined, but then as it comes out, it starts to twist and dip. A very, very beautiful design, and perfected with thousands of hours of wind tunnel tests, because of course there were no computers for design back in those days. Just as we pass in here, this is my very favourite car. This is one of 10 special edition Aston Martins that were commissioned by British Airways for the 50th anniversary of Concorde, and they are registered after all 10 British Concordes, where this one actually is registered Alpha Foxtrot after the aircraft. And it's, if ever I won the lottery, this would be my dream car. Okay, so we've talked about the wing, one of the three key technical things on the aircraft. This is the second, the intake system. Now, we had a look at the computers up on the engineer's panel that controlled the ramps on the intake, but this is a very, very clever bit of kit. So these ramps that have got danger marked on them, they're obviously off now because there's no power to the aircraft. But during flight, and particularly during supersonic flight, these ramps were moved and they were controlled by those computers on the flight deck. And what these ramps would do is they would slow the air down. Concorde's flying along 1,350 miles an hour, twice the speed of sound. If that air just went straight through into the engine, it would disintegrate and destroy the engine. So the designers had to come up with a way to slow that air down to subsonic speed so the engines could function during supersonic flight. This intake system and the positioning of the ramps would slow the air down from 1,350 miles an hour to around about 350, 400 miles an hour just in this 11 feet. So where the red line starts is where the Olympus engine starts. So just to give you an idea of dimensions, that 11-foot structure would slow the air down by 1,000 miles an hour. What that also done, of course, is it generated additional air pressure coming through the turbine, which created thrust. So at supersonic speeds, the engines are actually only providing around about 30 to 35% of the thrust. The rest is coming from the intake system and the very clever bucket system and exhaust system on the aircraft. At supersonic speeds, which nobody believes when I tell them this on the tour, these engines were one of the most fuel efficient in the world. At subsonic speeds, however, she drank fuel. So that's the wing, that's the intake system, two of the three key things that made the aircraft so technically special. Okay, so as we come to the back of the aircraft, okay, so we'll film this side, right? But what you'll notice on the back of the aircraft, these buckets, which again are all electronically controlled. Those buckets would continuously move during the supersonic flight, and depending on how much thrust you basically wanted out of the back of the aircraft would determine the shape on those buckets. Now, if you look on the structure of the wing, Concorde doesn't have any elevators or flaps or slats. The flying controls combined into one control unit called an elevon, which gives you pitch and roll. What that means is when Concorde lands, there's nothing to slow it down as on a conventional subsonic aircraft. So those buckets would reverse inwards, and that, coupled with the very powerful carbon fibre brakes on the aircraft, would slow Concorde down from 186 miles an hour, which was a typical landing speed, to around 30 miles an hour in a very, very short time. All right, so we're at the rear fuselage of the aircraft. So this door here is access to the rear cargo hold. You also notice underneath the cargo hold door, that little, looks like a little fin with hot written on it. Now, there's several of those on the aircraft, and they are actually heated during flight, and it's where the water is released from the sinks on the aircraft and the galleys. Obviously our aircraft's registration. Now at the rear of the fuselage is one of the two trim tanks where fuel was pumped from one end of the aircraft to the other. So as I mentioned up on the flight deck, 13 fuel tanks, but only 11 of them are situated in the centre fuselage and the wings of the actual storage tanks. The tank at the rear and the tank at the after the aircraft are trim tanks, which were pumped continuously to keep that centre of gravity level during flight. Got a third undercarriage here, which was designed for the aircraft because of the very steep angle of attack the aircraft will come in to land and take off. As far as we're aware, British Airways never utilised it. Air France, on the other hand, had a very bad landing with one of their Concordes in the early 80s in a place called Dakar in Senegal, and they came in at a very steep angle of attack, too steep, and they crushed the rear fuselage of the aircraft. So that aircraft was repaired, but the repair added weight, so it was uneconomical to continue flying it, and that aircraft was then cut up in the mid-90s. So Air France actually lost 2 of their aircraft. Okay, so as we look at the rear of the aircraft here, you'll see these 2 red lines, which are very, very important, and the aircraft cannot take off without those 2 red lines. It's basically where the catering trucks would align and drive up to the aircraft so they could gain access to the rear galley of the aircraft to stock all your champagne and your smoked salmon, etc. for your flight. So we talked about Concorde's very beautiful wing design. Here's a fantastic place for you to see this. So from the front, it looks like a delta wing. Now, of course, you can see that's not strictly true. Okay, so ailerons are now obviously drooped because there's no power on the aircraft anymore, but in flight they would have been powered and streamlined. You'll notice at the back of each aileron, these covers, these are what are called the power control flying units. Concorde is fly-by-wire, as I've mentioned to you, and underneath here will be the mechanics and the wiring to electronically control the ailerons from the flight deck. And here is one of the 4 Olympus 593 engines. In between each engine there's a firewall, of course, just in case. But as I mentioned to you, apart from the standard decommissioning that British Airways carried out on the aircraft, which got rid of things like the escape slides, oxygen, the fuel, the hydraulic fluid, etc., the aircraft is complete, right down to these engines, which of course powered her home for the final time. So to start the engines on Concorde, they would, because there's no auxiliary engine on the aircraft to provide power, so they would have to have what's called ground power plugged into the aircraft. The other thing then that was required was to have what's called an air starter to power up the first of the 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines. Now this is the section here where they would basically plug in an air ground supply to pump air into the engine, which would enable the engines then to spool up when obviously the instructions are given from the ground crew to the flight deck. And you may see videos on YouTube of the flight deck where the flight engineer will call down, "Hello ground, we'll take the air on number 3 or number 4. And the air on 3, air would come up, and then they would start the power up procedure from the flight deck. Once one engine was running, they could then take away the ground power unit, because then the aircraft's hydraulics and electrical systems would come online. But then they would move the air starter to the other side to fire up one of those engines, and then the other 2 outboard engines could then be started. Okay, so Concorde's main undercarriage. These are the brand new tyres which were fitted for the return to service in 2001, designed by Michelin. They are actually called NZG tyres, or near zero growth. These tyres were designed specifically that had these run over that strip of titanium in Paris, the tyre, yes, would have punctured, but it wouldn't have disintegrated. So in effect, they are a little like bulletproof tyres. Each of the 4 tyres on the undercarriage takes approximately 220 psi. Inside here are the brake fans and obviously the carbon fibre brakes. Coming around here, as I mentioned, the Wiring around the undercarriage is all armour plated, one of the requirements for the return to service in 2001. And you'll notice that the undercarriage is actually very, very tall. Now if this undercarriage just retracted into the main doors here, it would cross in the middle and wouldn't fit. So, again in one motion, as the undercarriage is retracting, it actually reduces in length, just as it's hitting the main undercarriage doors. So again, a beautiful feat of engineering. All these panels in the wings are the fuel tanks. So these were all fitted with the Kevlar sheets. And that's a very, very brief overview of the last Concorde for you.